Imagine a night where the ocean sparkled with golden lights, where a billionaire's yacht floated like a palace on water, and every guest wore diamonds brighter than the stars above. But when the unimaginable happened, when the powerful CEO slipped and fell into the dark sea, the truth of loyalty was revealed. Because in that moment of crisis, the people he trusted most froze, and the only one who acted was a poor waitress no one had even noticed. What followed would shock them all. So grab your popcorn, sit tight because this is not just a story of wealth and glamour. It's about courage, betrayal, and the moment when true character is revealed. And if you're new here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories that keep you hooked until the very end. The Reed family yacht was the kind of vessel people whispered about long after it passed through the harbor. It stretched across the water like a floating mansion, its glass windows glowing under chandeliers, its decks polished until they shone like mirrors. That evening, it was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. A live jazz band played on the upper deck, their instruments filling the night air with smooth notes. Inside, the guest list was a who's who of the city's elite. Politicians mingled with actors, business tycoons toasted with influencers, and every corner echoed with chatter about money, connections, and power. Waiters carried trays of caviar, champagne flowed endlessly, and the sea breeze carried the perfume of roses and expensive colognes. At the center of it all was Alexander Reed, the billionaire CEO whose name commanded respect across industries. Tall, handsome, and wrapped in a tailored suit, he moved with the quiet authority of a man used to commanding rooms. Guests swarmed around him, shaking his hand, praising his empire, flattering his every move. "Alexander, that new project of yours will change the skyline," one investor said eagerly. "Mr. Reed, you simply must attend my gala next week," a senator's wife added. Alexander smiled politely, nodded at the compliments, and lifted his glass at the right moments. To the crowd, he was untouchable, but deep inside, he felt the same emptiness he always carried. None of these people really cared for him. They cared for his money, his influence, the doors he could open. When he looked at them, he saw masks. And then there was Sophie Carter. Dressed in the plain black skirt and white blouse of the catering staff, Sophie weaved silently among the glamorous crowd, balancing a tray of drinks. She was only 23, but the weight of her life already showed in her tired eyes. Her mother was bedridden with illness, her younger brother needed school fees, and Sophie worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. The wealthy guests barely noticed her. Some snapped their fingers impatiently, others shoved empty glasses onto her tray without a glance. One woman hissed at her, "Don't get too close, dear. This dress costs more than your entire life savings." Sophie bit her tongue, smiling politely, as she always did. Yet as she worked, she noticed Alexander. Unlike the others who laughed and boasted, his eyes sometimes drifted away, fixed on the horizon. When no one was looking, his smile faded and his shoulders slumped. He looked lonely. Sophie thought it strange. How could a man with everything look like he had nothing? The party raged on, music swelled, people danced, and the yacht glowed like a star in the night sea. But just after midnight, as the crowd reached its peak, Alexander excused himself from a group of investors and stepped onto the quieter deck for fresh air. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, the waves catching silver from the moonlight. For the first time that evening, he let out a long sigh, loosening his tie. The laughter and chatter inside felt miles away. Here he could breathe, but the deck was wet, slick with spilled champagne. In a split second, his polished shoe slipped. His body jolted, his hands reached for the railing, but missed. And then, splash! The sound silenced the laughter instantly. Gasps erupted. Guests rushed to the railing, their jeweled hands clutching the sides as they peered down. "Did he just fall?" someone shrieked. "Oh my God, it's Alexander! Somebody do something!" But nobody moved. Men shouted for the crew. Women screamed and clutched their gowns. A few pulled out their phones, recording the chaos instead of helping. Down below, Alexander thrashed in the freezing water. The heavy weight of his suit dragged him under, water filling his lungs as he gasped for air. He kicked furiously, panic clawing through him. He looked up. All he saw were blurred figures standing uselessly at the railing. Not one of them jumped. And then a sharp crash cut through the noise. A tray clattered to the deck, glasses shattering. Sophie had dropped it. Without a second thought, she kicked off her shoes, tore off her apron, and sprinted toward the railing. "Wait, what are you doing?" one guest shouted. "She's insane," another scoffed. But Sophie didn't hear them. Her heart pounded as she hurled herself over the edge. The cold sea swallowed her, shocking her body, but she fought through it. She wasn't a strong swimmer, but her arms sliced desperately through the water as she pushed toward him. Alexander's vision blurred, his strength failing. Just as his body began to sink, a hand gripped his arm. Sophie's face broke through the spray of water, pale with fear, but burning with determination. "Hold on," she cried, her voice ragged as she fought to keep them both afloat. In that moment, Alexander's mind reeled. Of all the powerful, wealthy people on board, the only one willing to risk her life for him was the poor waitress no one even noticed. And as the waves roared around them, the truth hit harder than the cold water. Everything he thought he knew about loyalty was about to change forever. The cold water burned like knives against Alexander's skin. He flailed, his lungs screaming, as salt water forced its way into his mouth. His expensive suit, tailored from the finest fabric, now felt like an anchor dragging him beneath the waves. Above him, blurred faces leaned over the railing, shouting, screaming, recording. None of them moved. "Help me!" he gasped, though the waves swallowed his voice. Panic spread through his chest, heavier than the water pulling him down. Then, through the chaos, a hand latched onto his arm. "Hold on!" Sophie's voice cut through the night air, raw with fear but fierce with determination. She kicked with all her strength, fighting the current. Her arms shook, her lungs ached, but she refused to let go. Alexander blinked in disbelief. Of all the guests, of all the so-called friends who had toasted him minutes ago, it wasn't them, it was her. The poor waitress who had been invisible the whole night. The crowd above erupted into a new wave of noise. "She jumped in! Is she crazy? She's going to drown with him." But Sophie blocked them out. She looped her arm under Alexander's chest, using every ounce of her strength to keep his head above the water. The waves slammed into her face, salt burning her eyes, but she pushed forward. "Breathe! Just breathe!" she shouted, coughing as water splashed over her. Alexander choked, his body convulsing as he tried to follow her words. For a man who controlled billion-dollar empires, who commanded rooms with his presence, he had never felt so helpless and so humbled. The crew scrambled into action at last. A lifebuoy splashed into the water, followed by a rope. "Hold on! We're pulling you in!" one of them shouted. Sophie paddled toward the buoy, dragging Alexander with her. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she clenched her jaw and refused to stop. She could hear her heart thundering in her ears, each beat telling her that if she let go, he wouldn't survive. Finally, she grabbed the buoy and wrapped Alexander's limp arms around it. The crew heaved, pulling them closer to the yacht. Sophie's vision blurred, her arms like lead, but she kept pushing until strong hands hauled Alexander over the railing. Moments later, rough hands grabbed her too, dragging her onto the deck. The world spun as Sophie collapsed onto the floor, coughing seawater. Her chest burned, her skin shivered violently from the cold. But her first thought wasn't about herself. She turned toward Alexander. He lay on his side, choking and gasping, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. A crewman pressed his back, helping him spit out the water. His once perfect suit clung to him like a second skin, ruined. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and glassy. The guests stood frozen, a circle of jeweled faces staring down at him. None of them moved closer. Some whispered nervously. Others adjusted their gowns and suits as if the chaos were merely an inconvenience. Finally, one woman muttered, "Well, at least he's alive." "Thank God the staff was quick," another man scoffed. "Risky move, really. What if they both drowned? That girl was foolish." Their words stabbed Sophie's ears. She stared at them, her chest heaving, and for the first time, she saw them for what they truly were. People who valued image over humanity. Alexander coughed violently, then rolled weakly onto his back. His blurred vision locked onto Sophie. She sat drenched, shivering, her hair plastered against her face, her lips trembling from the cold, but her eyes wide, honest, and unwavering, were fixed only on him. "You saved me," he rasped. Sophie shook her head quickly. Anyone would have, but they both knew the truth. Anyone could have, yet no one else did. The captain hurried forward. "Mr. Reed, sir, we should get you changed immediately." "You'll catch a chill." Two assistants rushed to lift Alexander, but he raised a shaky hand. His gaze never left Sophie. "Her first. Make sure she's all right." The assistants blinked in surprise but obeyed, wrapping a blanket around Sophie's trembling shoulders. She hugged it close, whispering a faint, "Thank you." Alexander allowed the crew to help him to his feet, but his mind was spinning. Just minutes ago, he had been surrounded by dozens of people eager to flatter him. And yet, when his life depended on it, not one of them had moved. Only her, the invisible waitress. The party slowly resumed in hushed tones, guests retreating to their glasses of champagne and whispered gossip. But for Alexander, the night would never be the same. As Sophie was led below deck to warm up, he watched her go, his heart pounding with something unfamiliar, gratitude mixed with curiosity, and a deep, unsettling question. Why would she risk her life for me when no one else did? He had built his empire on power and money, but in the cold grip of the sea, it wasn't wealth that saved him. It was courage, and it came from the last person he ever expected. The yacht was quiet again. The laughter had returned, the jazz band resumed their music, but the earlier shock still lingered in whispers among the guests. Some called it an accident, others a spectacle. A few even laughed behind their glasses of wine, already twisting the story to make themselves sound more important. But for Alexander Reed, nothing felt the same. He sat in his private cabin now, wrapped in a robe, his hair still damp, his chest sore from choking up seawater. The glass of brandy on the table before him went untouched. His mind kept replaying the image of the dark waves closing over him, and the hand that pulled him back. Sophie, the waitress, the one no one noticed. He had shaken hands with senators, dined with kings, signed billion-dollar contracts. Yet in his moment of need, not one of those powerful people had moved. They had stood frozen, worried about their gowns, their watches, their shoes. And the person who had nothing to lose, the one with the most to fear, had been the only one to leap. Alexander rose, restless. He needed to see her. Down below, the crew had gathered in the small staff lounge. Sophie sat on a wooden bench, her damp hair now wrapped in a towel, her body still trembling despite the warm tea in her hands. She hadn't expected thanks. In fact, part of her braced for scolding. She had broken protocol, dropped an entire tray of expensive glasses, and put herself at risk. A fellow waitress nudged her. "You're brave, Sophie." "I wouldn't have dared." Sophie gave a weak smile. "Brave or foolish. I don't even swim that well." She took another sip of tea, her eyes distant. "I just couldn't stand there and watch him drown." That was when the door opened. The room fell silent as Alexander Reed stepped inside. Even in a simple robe and slippers, his presence commanded attention. The staff froze, unsure whether to bow, greet, or simply vanish. But his eyes found only one person. "Sophie Carter," he said softly. Her head jerked up, startled. No one of his stature ever remembered the staff's names. "Yes, sir," she said quickly, rising to her feet. He studied her for a long moment. She looked smaller now, wrapped in a plain blanket, her hands trembling slightly around the teacup. Yet to him she appeared stronger than anyone upstairs in gowns and diamonds. "Walk with me," he said gently. The staff exchanged wide-eyed glances as Sophie followed him out. Her heart pounded. Was she in trouble? Would he fire her for breaking rules? Her feet felt heavy as she trailed him into the quieter corridor of the yacht. They stopped at a small lounge overlooking the sea. Moonlight poured through the glass windows, casting silver across the waves. For a moment they stood in silence, the hum of the ocean filling the air. Finally, Alexander turned to her. "You saved my life." Sophie shook her head quickly, clutching the blanket tighter. "No, sir. I just did what anyone would have done. Anyone. His voice carried both amusement and bitterness. Sophie, there were over 100 people on that deck tonight. Politicians, business tycoons, celebrities. Not one of them jumped. Not one. Except you. She lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the weight of his gaze. I wasn't thinking. I just saw you fall and I moved. That's all. Alexander took a step closer, his voice softer now. That's not all. You risked your life for me, a man who didn't even know your name. Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him she didn't need thanks, that it was instinct, but the sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. Most wealthy people she had served barely noticed she existed. Yet here was Alexander Reed, billionaire CEO, speaking to her as though she mattered. Why? He asked suddenly. His eyes searched hers. Why would you do it? Sophie hesitated, then answered quietly. Because life is precious. Rich or poor, everyone deserves to be saved if you can help. And I couldn't just watch. For the first time that night, Alexander felt something shift inside him. Not admiration, not obligation, something deeper. Her words carried a truth he hadn't heard in years, a reminder that humanity wasn't measured in dollars. Thank you, he said simply. Sophie blinked. She hadn't expected that. Not from him, but before she could reply, footsteps echoed in the hall. The door swung open and two of the investors stumbled in, laughing loudly with glasses in hand. They froze when they saw Sophie standing beside Alexander. Their eyes narrowed instantly. Ah, one of them smirked. So this is the waitress, the hero of the evening? His tone dripped with sarcasm. Well done, dear. Risking your life for the boss. Quite the performance. The other chuckled. Don't get used to it, sweetheart. Don't think this makes you special. Sophie's face flushed red. She lowered her gaze, gripping her blanket. The sting of their mockery cut deep, but Alexander's voice sliced through the room like steel. Enough! The men fell silent, startled. Alexander stepped in front of Sophie, his gaze icy. This woman did what none of you could. She saved my life while you all stood frozen. Show her respect or get off my yacht. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the waves outside. The two men exchanged awkward glances before muttering excuses and retreating. Sophie's eyes widened. No one had ever defended her like that. She whispered, You didn't have to. Yes, Alexander interrupted gently. I did. For the first time in years, Sophie felt seen. Not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a person who mattered. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt gratitude. Not for money, not for power, but for the courage of a girl who reminded him of what truly mattered. And though neither of them said it aloud, in that quiet lounge overlooking the endless sea, a bond had begun. Fragile, unexpected, but unbreakable. The morning after the yacht party, headlines exploded. Billionaire CEO nearly drowns, saved by waitress. Hero of the night, unknown worker, risks life for Reed Enterprises boss. Guests watched, waitress acted. Who really cares for the rich? Paparazzi pictures splashed across front pages. Alexander being pulled out of the sea, Sophie shivering in a blanket at his side, her face pale but determined. Social media turned the story viral within hours. Some called her brave. Others sneered that it was all an act, that she must have wanted attention, maybe even a payout. Inside the Reed mansion, Alexander scrolled through the news silently. His empire had weathered countless storms, but never one that touched him this personally. For once, the headlines weren't about his deals or his power. They were about the waitress who had risked everything to save him, and he couldn't stop thinking about her. By afternoon, Sophie was summoned to the mansion. She hesitated at the massive gates, her plain dress and scuffed shoes a sharp contrast to the marble drive and rows of luxury cars. She had never stepped into a world like this, and her palms sweated as the butler led her through the echoing halls. Alexander met her in the grand study, his suit crisp as ever, but his eyes softer than she remembered. He rose as she entered. Sophie, I wasn't sure you'd come. She clutched her worn handbag nervously. I didn't think I had a choice, sir. The guards looked like they'd drag me in if I said no. A smile tugged at his lips. Fair enough. Sit. She perched on the edge of the velvet chair, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked painfully out of place. Alexander leaned forward. I owe you my life. And no matter how many times you tell me you don't want thanks, I can't ignore what you did. So, tell me, what do you want, Sophie? Anything? Her eyes widened. Anything? Yes. His voice was steady. Education? A house for your family? Money for your mother's treatment? Say it, but Sophie shook her head firmly. No, sir. I didn't save you for a reward. I did it because it was right. That's all. Her refusal stunned him. He was a man who had always dealt in transactions, where every favor had a price. Yet here she was, untouched by greed, unmoved by offers that would make others bow at his feet. Then at least, Alexander said after a pause, allow me to do something small. Join me tomorrow at the gala. As my guest, her jaw dropped. A gala? Me? Yes. People will talk regardless. Let them see the woman who saved me. She laughed nervously. Or let them see a maid pretending to belong. Alexander's expression hardened. You don't need to pretend. You already did what no one else could. That's worth more than any gown or diamond. The next evening, Sophie stood at the edge of the Reed ballroom, dressed in a simple but elegant gown Alexander had arranged for her. The chandeliers sparkled, violins played, and the city's finest paraded across the marble floors. Yet whispers filled the air the moment she appeared at his side. Is that her? The waitress? She looks nervous. Poor thing. Imagine, trying to climb this high. It won't last. Sophie's cheeks burned, but Alexander never let go of her arm. He guided her through the room, greeting guests with his usual poise, ignoring their pointed stares. At the refreshment table, a woman in a glittering emerald dress leaned close, her voice sharp but coated in sugar. You're very brave, dear. Risking your life for Mr. Reed. Tell me, was it bravery or just ambition? Sophie froze, her throat tight. She opened her mouth, but Alexander spoke first, his voice cold as steel. Careful with your words. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here tonight. Show some respect. The woman blanched and stepped back quickly. For the rest of the evening, Sophie felt every eye on her, some filled with curiosity, others dripping with contempt. But each time the pressure threatened to break her, Alexander's steady presence at her side anchored her. And as the night wore on, something quietly shifted. Sophie realized she wasn't just the girl who saved a billionaire anymore. She was becoming the woman who had forced him and everyone else to see the difference between wealth and worth. By the following week, the story of Alexander Reed and the waitress who saved him had spread far beyond the city. Every magazine, every gossip column, every social media page buzzed with speculation. Who is Sophie Carter? From waitress to high society, lucky or calculated? Is the billionaire smitten, or is it just gratitude? Some hailed her as a hero. Others painted her as an opportunist who had cleverly used the accident to climb into Alexander's world. And in the polished corridors of high society, envy sharpened tongues into daggers. At first, Sophie tried to ignore it. She kept working at the hotel where she picked up shifts, stayed out of sight, and refused every reporter who came knocking at her tiny apartment door. But when Alexander began inviting her to more events, insisting she belong by his side, the whispers turned vicious. At one charity gala, she felt their stares like knives. Women in sparkling gowns whispered behind painted nails. Men smirked openly. That must be her, the waitress. She'll never last. He'll get bored. She looks like she borrowed that dress from Goodwill. Sophie's chest tightened as she clutched her glass of water. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to run back to her old world, where no one cared if her shoes weren't designer or her laugh wasn't polished. But Alexander noticed. When one particularly cruel guest sneered, "Tell me, Miss Carter, how does it feel to be the charity case of the year?" Sophie froze, her lips parting in shock. Before she could reply, Alexander's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Enough! The room fell silent. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the crowd. This woman risked her life for me. While the rest of you stood still, she jumped into the sea without hesitation. If you call her a charity case, then you call me unworthy of the life she gave back. Gasps rippled through the hall. Sophie's eyes widened, her heart thundering. Alexander wasn't just defending her, he was challenging all of them. He turned, his voice firm but calm. I don't care for your whispers or your gossip. If Sophie is out of place here, then perhaps I am too. Because I would rather stand with someone real than sit among people who only care for appearances. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Then slowly the crowd resumed their chatter, though the tone had shifted. Some looked away ashamed. Others muttered in resentment. But no one dared to mock Sophie again, not while Alexander Reed stood by her side. Later that night, after the gala ended, Sophie pulled him aside. They stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, the cool breeze brushing past them. Why did you do that? She whispered, her voice trembling. Defend me like that? You don't have to ruin your reputation because of me. Alexander looked at her, his expression unreadable at first. Then his eyes softened. Reputation? Sophie, do you think I built an empire because I cared what people whispered? I've spent years surrounded by liars, flatterers, and opportunists. But you, he paused, taking a breath, you're the only one who acted when it mattered. You've already given me more than all of them combined. Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She shook her head. I don't belong in your world. Maybe, he said quietly, but maybe my world is what's wrong. And maybe it needs you more than you realize. Sophie turned away, overwhelmed. She had saved him that night without thinking. She hadn't asked for this, the attention, the pressure, the cruel stares. But hearing him say those words stirred something inside her she hadn't felt in years. That she mattered, truly mattered to someone. For Alexander, the decision was already made. He would not let her slip away. Whatever the cost, whatever the world said, Sophie Carter had changed his life, and he wasn't going back. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Sophie had ever known. Every newspaper carried her name. Every gossip column twisted her story. Some painted her as a saint, the brave waitress who risked everything. Others sneered that she was a gold digger, waiting to trap a billionaire. At first, Sophie tried to avoid the noise. She threw herself back into work, cleaning tables and carrying trays as if nothing had changed. But it wasn't the same. Customers whispered, co-workers stared, and reporters waited outside the service entrance, shouting her name. One evening, as she left the hotel, a group of young women stopped her. So you're the one who thinks she's going to marry the CEO? One mocked. Don't flatter yourself. You'll never be one of us. The words stung, but Sophie held her head high and walked away. She had learned long ago that dignity didn't come from what people said, but from what you chose to do. Meanwhile, Alexander's world was changing too. Business partners cornered him at meetings, warning him that his reputation was at risk. People are talking, Alexander, one said. It's fine to show gratitude to the girl, but don't blur the lines. You're a Reed. You belong with women of your class. But Alexander didn't flinch. And where were those women when I was drowning? He asked coldly. Not one of them lifted a finger. Sophie did. That tells me everything I need to know. The final breaking point came at the annual Reed Enterprises Gala, a glittering event attended by every major figure in the city. Sophie had not planned to go. The thought of facing those sharp stares again filled her with dread. But Alexander insisted. Don't hide, he told her, his voice gentle but firm. You stood by me when no one else did. Now let me stand by you. That night, Sophie entered the ballroom at his side, wearing a modest gown he had chosen for her. The chandeliers sparkled above them, but the air was heavy with whispers. Every eye followed them as they crossed the marble floor. The speeches began, the orchestra played, but the tension lingered until Alexander finally took the stage. He stood tall, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. Many of you were there the night I nearly lost my life, he began, and many of you saw who saved it. It wasn't the men I've made deals with or the women who swore they admired me. It was someone none of you noticed. A young woman with no wealth, no status, only courage. Gasps rippled through the hall. Alexander's gaze swept the crowd, hard and unyielding. Her name is Sophie Carter, and while the rest of you recorded video and worried about your gowns, she was the one who jumped into the sea. She risked everything for nothing in return. Tell me, who among you can say the same? Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Then Alexander's voice softened. I don't care what society says. I don't care about whispers or reputations. From this day on, Sophie is not just the girl who saved my life. She is part of it, and anyone who cannot accept that does not belong in my circle. The hall erupted in stunned murmurs. Some scowled, others applauded, but no one dared challenge him. Sophie stood frozen, her heart hammering. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't asked for this. Yet as Alexander stepped down from the stage and took her hand, she saw in his eyes something undeniable: sincerity. Later that night, as the gala ended, they slipped out onto the balcony overlooking the glittering city. The noise inside faded, replaced by the hush of the ocean breeze. Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. Why me? Out of everyone, why choose me? Alexander's hand tightened around hers. Because you saw me as a man, not a CEO. Because when I was drowning, you didn't think about power or money or what people would say. You just acted, and I realized that's the kind of heart I want beside me. Not the richest, not the prettiest. The truest tears slipped down Sophie's cheeks, but for the first time, they weren't from fear or shame. They were from hope. For years, Alexander had been surrounded by people who wore masks. Now he finally stood beside someone who didn't. And Sophie, who had once been invisible, now stood in the light. Not because of diamonds or titles, but because of courage. This story reminds us that wealth and status can fill a room with admirers, but it cannot buy sincerity. True loyalty is revealed not in words, but in actions. And sometimes the person you least expect, the one overlooked by the crowd, is the only one who will risk everything when it matters most. If you enjoyed this story, don't just scroll past. Hit that like button, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more stories that prove real courage always shines brighter than gold. At Yacht Party, CEO accidentally fell into sea. Only a poor waitress tried to save him.